Welcome to the Supply Chain Revolution podcast. I'm your host, Sheri Hinish, also called the Supply Chain Queen, and I am so thrilled to introduce our new Student Voices series highlighting innovators under the age of 25 at the intersection of supply chain, sustainability, and innovation. And today we have Laurence Allen, who's the CEO and founder of Terranova, sitting at a really unique intersection of infrastructure, robotics, climate adaptation, and supply chain execution. So, Laurence, I'd love to kick off and learn a little bit more about Terranova, what you do, and what's your origin story? Like, where did this idea come from to live at the intersection of climate adaptation, infrastructure, robotics, which is super exciting, and supply chain execution?
Yeah, I have a pretty short background. I went to both Berkeley and briefly Stanford as well. And I also interned at SpaceX, but I have no other huge job experience besides some fun summer bio-research internships. So all of my lived experience has been condensed, and I'm now running a company that is mostly inspired by my experience growing up. I grew up in Santa Fe, which is a flood zone. It's about 6 feet under sea level, and so I was very aware of this very real need for climate adaptation from a young age. And that inspired the want to build this company. The result of that has been lots of challenges, a huge one being supply chain and trying to get lots of different industries parts together to build these strange big robots. And so we've had to source things from Europe, from China, from Canada, and all over the US. And I feel like I've seen pretty much every flavor of that by now.
Yeah, and global sourcing, as you know, especially with geopolitical risk and a lot of the uncertainty happening in the world, it can be a real conundrum. So I don't know if you've run into any regulatory constraints yet, but some of our previous guests have, they've had quite a time, I would say in the past 12 to 18 months, when they're sourcing globally in very discrete and niche areas of technology. So is that something that you've come across just out of curiosity?
We've certainly come into some regulatory issues. Most of them were tariff related or battery import related. We have also seen some sources that were single sources, which have been very interesting, not necessarily just full monopolies, but for example, pumps that are only made in Europe and strangely not made in China, where other pumps that are very similar are. I think you get really used to having multiple options for things in your everyday life, but frequently when you're building really large things, you'll use very niche parts, and the nicher the part, the less likely it is that you'll find a meaningful alternative.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think tariffs and a lot of what you're describing are front of mind for folks who are listening. And just to double click on your origin story, you have mentioned that you're building a new operating model for resilience. And this is drawn from your growing up in a flood zone. And so when we think about climate adaptation, a lot of people think of it as reactive and not necessarily proactively addressing it through terrain engineering. So can you give folks a flavor?
Sure. We are the first terraforming robotics company. Most people immediately assume Mars or the moon when I say that, but we're actually doing it here on Earth first. What we're really doing is reshaping land using underground injections, and specifically we're injecting a wood chip fill material in a slurry underground. And we're using that material and those injections to just directly lift the land above it. The best part about this is it doesn't matter very much what's on top of the land. So for example, if you had a highway or an aqueduct or a city, it would be about the same net effect as if you just had an open parcel that you were injecting on. The land and whatever's on it will just lift up. And so this works really, really well if you're in a coastal region or in a region experiencing pluvial flooding where you just have an elevation issue that's causing this flooding problem. And so this is a severe recurring issue in many cities. And because of that, you have this long-term maintenance expectation that always comes with these type of projects, because the subsidence problem is ongoing. It's not just the city was built in a flood zone. It's the city is sinking more and more into a more and more aggressive flood zone. And so coming up with a solution that doesn't just work now, but will work when you need a top up is very important.
What was the key insight that made you believe that land elevation could actually become practical at scale? Because you've described 4 or 5 cities, there's clearly a market need. What was that key insight that made you say, I can solve this problem, or I can help the world solve this problem?
First principles thinking is the first thing that comes up when you say that. I thought we should address the real problem, which is an elevation issue. Many people saw it as a flooding issue first, and to me, flooding is the resultant issue from elevation. And so that was probably the first real insight, was that that was not the right problem to be solving. The second one, I think, was a result potentially of the first very directly, which is that there just isn't very many things that you can do about elevation issues. It's currently getting done a lot in New Orleans right now, and it's done all over the coast and the Lower East Coast as well, but it's really not an ideal solution, and most people know that, which is why it is done pretty rarely for how relatively easy it is. It's just you end up with a pretty bad net result, which is that, the road to your house and your garage still flood. And so most people don't like that solution. And so because of that, you don't see it being implemented at a large scale. You also can't do that for larger footprint homes. When you start thinking about that, everyone can imagine what it'd be like to, blow a whoopee cushion up underground or, under a book or something and see it lift up. And so I'm kind of coming with that same childish idea of, why don't you just lift it up? What's stopping it? And we just tried it out. Pretty quickly, we realized there isn't any giant physical blocker that's making this impossible. It's really human ingenuity and engineering challenges that are the issue. So this system is not just becoming very quickly and very obviously the right idea for lifting land at scale, but it's becoming relatively obvious that it can be implemented at scale and manufactured at the appropriate scales.
Yeah, I mean, it's super cool. I love that you brought up first principles because we talk a lot about that. We've talked with a lot of other founders on the podcast, and it seems so simple, right? But you have an entire paradigm shift that you're thinking about, and there's billions of dollars spent in this space, especially in coastal communities that I rattle off the top of my head where I see pulverized rock and it's like, build higher. One of the things that I was thinking about when you were just describing your first principles was just that I wonder if SpaceX, if your time there has influenced, these hard to engineer or solutions that seem very, I don't know, like obvious, but people don't have the courage and the tenacity to actually see it through. Were you influenced at all through your role at SpaceX?
I definitely was. I was certainly influenced to action, which I think is what you're getting at. Not only that, but we have 2 other engineers who also previously worked at SpaceX. And one of the main things you notice about engineers who did work there versus didn't is that from day one, they feel empowered to just go do things, which as a boss, especially of a startup company, is fantastic. I love it when people just go do things and, are not asking permission to do tiny little iterations or, permission on every change that they think they have to do. And so I think that effectiveness comes directly out of the SpaceX culture. You're expected to deal with really a lot of hardware at SpaceX and to be a very direct owner of that. And there are not alternate parties that are also responsible for your same hardware. And so, for example, when I worked on Dragon, there would be a single manufacturing engineer and a single responsible engineer that would be responsible for the completion of this part. And so getting to see that, and then an even more extreme version over at Starbase when I was there briefly, where you have build engineers that are responsible for both, and it's like literally just their hardware. And the hardware is this huge piece, and it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, and maybe they have 5 of them, but it's just their responsibility. Has been really informative for how we do ownership here. We have 2 engineers right now that own basically the entire system. They expect that it's their job to work with these technicians directly to do these builds and that they're responsible for whether it goes good or bad. And I feel like there's almost no training involved because we're all coming from that same world.
Wow. It's a beautiful thing when you describe it because I've lived in startups, but I've also lived in mammoth organizations, hundreds of thousands of people where complexity kills pace and it also kills scale, especially when you're in a category making sort of very niche engineering environment. I wanted to close and ask you what success would look like or what would change for cities and infrastructure owners, communities, a lot of governments and municipalities if the work that you're leading, the revolution that you're leading, really, if it becomes meaningful at scale, like what becomes possible that isn't possible today?
One of my favorite parts about this technology is it's not just better, faster, but it's cheaper. And so for the first time, cities can actually afford to fix their own flood problems. You have this huge recurring issue that is resulting in extreme inaction that cities just can't afford any of the flood problem solutions. If they think the only solution that's possible is a giant seawall, then of course the right answer is to have the city manager and the entire city functionally turn into a PR campaign to try to get lots of federal money so they can afford this multi-billion-dollar seawall. But if cities have that paradigm shift and accept this new revolution, which is that you can just lift your entire city up inexpensively with biomass that's already available probably in your city and on whatever budget you would like, because you can do it slowly on a maintenance budget or all at once if you prefer to. I think they will start to just address their own problems, to be pragmatic, to maybe front load the problem when they know that sea level rise is coming or they know subsidence is coming, instead of what's happening now, which is they are always being reactive. They're reacting to a major flood event. So we are very excited to be bringing, in our opinion, the first real practical flood solution to market. It is very scalable, so it works across a lot of areas. It's not as selective as previous ones were, but I'm very hopeful that this will bring a lot more normalcy to the problem and that solutions will start to resemble each other instead of being so custom tailored to each city.
Yeah. And what cities do you have in mind as you start to ramp up this year?
We are very excited about Louisiana. I'm hoping that we will begin work there by the end of the year. Of course, Miami also floods terribly, and so it's hard to imagine a scale that doesn't involve getting to Miami-Dade County relatively quickly. You also see pretty crazy problems in the Northeast in the US, and of course California, where I live, has terrible flood problems as well. I'm very hopeful that we can solve many of the problems that the Bay Area has, but I'm also trying to make sure that we continue to validate this technology in other areas. We think this is the solution for all American cities for sea level rise and for subsidence issues, and so I'm pretty focused on purposefully going out early to other states so that we can show this off to the masses and make this not look like some little, blue state solution.
Yeah, it's really cool. I think also forming partnerships of unusual collaborators, definitely governments and municipalities, but then also capital markets, building those sorts of partnerships. It's good for the planet. It's good for the communities that supply chains serve and touch. And it would also be great for Terranova. And Laurence, for folks who want to learn more about Terranova, how can they find you and reach out to you?
Terranova.inc and also terranova.inc/careers if you'd like to join our team.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I wish you all the best. And I love what you're doing. Keep doing it. Keep fighting. Keep thriving, I should say. And it's been a pleasure to host you.
Thank you so much for having me on. Have a nice day.
All right. Bye-bye.